Welcome to the debate. Our discussion today focuses on, well, perhaps one of the most revealing moments in consciousness research, the flip. This is that highly discontinuous, very abrupt loss of consciousness we see when a patient goes under general anesthesia. And for the Asymptotic Necessity Theory, or ANT, this event really functions as a kind of perfect natural experiment, integrating all its core variables.
It really does. And its significance, well, it can't be overstated, can it? If we, accept the basic premise that consciousness is fundamentally a physical state, one that's actively maintained against constant metabolic pressure, then the flip is the precise, predictable moment where that structure fails. So our central question today, I think, is whether this catastrophic, abrupt transition, the flip, can be fully explained by, let's say, highly complex classical computation, or if its sheer magnitude and apparent necessity provide unassailable proof that consciousness actually depends on some kind of non-classical physical law.
Right, and I'll be arguing for the latter, the non-classical necessity of the flip. I contend that the system's instantaneous, almost catastrophic collapse is only really explicable if the structural stability of consciousness relies on an irreducible, what we call a Tier 2 physical property, that is instantaneously terminated right at a precise metabolic threshold. And I'll be arguing that while the mathematics describing this collapse are, frankly, highly compelling and rigorous, the flip is fundamentally a classical cascade failure. It's a complex, nonlinear phase transition that, despite its severity, doesn't require us to invoke the, well, let's be honest, highly speculative input of non-classical physics to understand it. It's complexity, pure and simple, not quantum mechanics.
Okay. My thesis, then, it rests on the principle of asymptotic friction, or path. This principle dictates that consciousness requires a non-classical input, what ANT calls the Irreducible Surprise, or IS event, for its very stability. And we actually have a direct, falsifiable causal chain here, starting with the anesthesia itself. Anesthesia, it isn't really a consciousness remover, it's fundamentally a metabolic suppressor. It reduces the grain's global metabolic budget, which we label M, linearly, say from a baseline of 1.0 down towards 0.55. Now, this linear drop directly causes the maximum sustainable coherence, RSUS, to fall. And the entire process, well, it hinges on a knife-edge moment when RSUS drops below this extremely demanding critical precision threshold, RC, which our calculations put at approximately 0.997.
Right, 0.997. That's a staggering level of precision to maintain. It sounds almost impossibly fine-tuned, doesn't it? But maybe the question is, why does a drop of just 0.003 of a point incoherent? Why does that initiate such a catastrophe?
Because of the structural geometry of consciousness itself. See, the loss of coherence is catastrophically magnified by the system's incredibly high dimensionality exponent, which we call n. In the ANT model, we calculate n to be approximately 330. You can kind of think of the system like a massive Jenga tower built on an extremely sensitive, maybe even fragile base. So that tiny, precise drop in coherence below 0.997 gets amplified by this enormous exponent n approximately 330. And this causes the system's state function, which we measure experimentally using the PCI, or Perturbational Complexity Index, to collapse discontinuously. We observe it dropping from roughly 0.16, the conscious state, down to about 0.31, the unconscious state. This structural failure, this is the flip, and it instantly terminates the non-classical irreducible surprise signal, the IS signal, what we also call the precision resonance, which is our model for the signal of absolute certainty. The sheer magnitude of that collapse, it really demands the existence of a Tier 2 property to explain the stability that it just lost.
Okay, I see why you characterize it as a demand. But from my perspective, I believe you've only really managed to redescribe a highly complex, nonlinear classical cascade failure Using, yes, novel and formalized terminology, we agree entirely on the observational data. The PCI collapse is real. The calculation of n, approximately 330, seems mathematically sound based on the model. Where we diverge fundamentally is the necessity of invoking this non-classical break.
But that necessity is precisely how we propose to solve the hard problem. A Tier 1 classical computational system, it can only ever describe how consciousness is generated functionally. A Tier 2 physical property is required to explain why it feels like something, why it is, in fact, irreducible.
And that, right there, is the central and currently unproven assertion. Look, the observed phase transition is perfectly consistent with existing classical complexity models. That high exponent, n approximately 330, it simply reflects the extreme structural fragility and, let's face it, the metabolic expense inherent in maintaining such highly integrated, nonlinear feedback loops. My position is that the claim that this structural collapse requires the loss of some phase lock with the universal computational substrate to stop generating a p=1 signal, well, that remains an unverified hypothesis. There's simply no proof as yet that the IS event is truly non-classical. It could just be an incredibly sophisticated, extraordinarily high-speed, integrated classical signal generated right at the system's operational limits.
But if it were merely classical, why would the system be compelled, as PAF suggests, to generate it for structural stability? The flip doesn't seem like an arbitrary error. It looks like an enforcement.
Well, and your reliance on the as-yet unperformed split-brain quantum test to potentially prove Bell inequality violations, that just shows that the non-classical pillar is entirely speculative at this point. Therefore, the entire causal chain, while I grant you mathematically elegant, it relies on a premise that might very well be fully explained by current functionalist computationalism. And that unfortunately leaves the hard problem exactly where it started, as a philosophical gap, maybe, but not necessarily a physical one demanding new laws.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame the nature of PAF rather differently. The principle of asymptotic friction isn't simply a description of what happens when complex systems fail. We propose it as a universal, prescriptive meta-law. It dictates that this structural failure must happen right at that RC threshold for the system to remain stable within the universe's constraints. The flip is the physical enforcement of this law. Consciousness, this IS event, it's proposed as a Tier 2 physical property that's required to generate the necessary friction to prevent the system from collapsing into, say, an unstable singularity. Maybe think of it like this. You can't explain the subjective wave, the feeling of being, using only the language of the billiard balls, the classical computation that merely generates its necessary preconditions. You need the physics of the wave itself.
That's a compelling argument, I admit, positioning PAF as some kind of mandate from the universe. However, I really must challenge whether PAF truly functions as a prescriptive physical law, like gravity, or if it is currently just a highly accurate descriptive heuristic. It describes convergent, emergent patterns beautifully. Think of highly complex classical systems like global weather patterns or even high-speed financial markets. They demonstrate self-limiting structural boundaries. They flip into stable configurations, or they crash based on highly nonlinear dynamics when certain precision thresholds are breached. We see patterns of convergent evolution everywhere in biology, but we don't automatically assume that requires new physics beyond selection acting on complex systems. The point is, we lack the proven underlying physical mechanism for this friction generation that would differentiate PAF from just an extremely powerful mathematical model of complexity. If the IS event turns out to be just a very complex Tier 1 signal, then the law kind of reduces to descriptive statistics, doesn't it? Not really a theorem?
I'm not entirely convinced by that line of reasoning, primarily because the causality we're modeling is so physically precise. We aren't just modeling abstract markets, we are modeling biology constrained by fundamental thermodynamics. The drop in metabolic energy, M, is the direct physical driver causing the structural collapse because the system literally loses the sheer energy required to sustain that high coherence state.
This, to me, proves consciousness is an actively maintained physical state that's constantly fighting against entropic pressure. And the equation R_sus equals 1K, 1m, it precisely predicts the metabolic efficiency coefficient, K, around 0.00677 that forces the system towards that RC approximately 0.997 threshold where the collapse must begin. The physical energy constraints are directly generating the informational catastrophe.
Okay, but I come at it from a slightly different angle. While energy loss is, yes, indisputably the initiating event, anesthesia acts as the linear suppressor. We agree there. The nonlinear collapse itself seems entirely attributable to the extreme fragility of a classical system that happens to be dependent on such incredibly high precision thresholds. That very small efficiency coefficient, K approximately 0.00667, it certainly confirms the system is metabolically fragile, very costly to run, yes. But costliness doesn't necessitate quantum physics. You know, many highly optimized classical supercomputing clusters operate near their tolerance limits, and they can fail catastrophically when energy inputs fluctuate just slightly. The collapse of the PCI from approximately 0.60 down to approximately 0.31 is an observable result of structural integrity failure, absolutely. But it is not, in itself, proof of a non-classical phase lock failing. It just shows the conscious brain is expensive and fragile, but that expense seems perfectly consistent with classical integrated information processing running right at the very edge of physical possibility.
All right. Well, moving from the energy dynamics then, let's look at the subjective experience of that collapse, because that's arguably the ultimate test, isn't it? The key consequence of this structural failure, according to ENT, is the cessation of local time flow. With the structural collapse, the IS signal is no longer generated. This causes the precision density, dP, which we can proxy experimentally by looking at characteristic P3A bursts, to collapse discontinuously, from something greater than 10 units epoch basically down to 0.
Okay, that claim, the cessation of local time flow, that's perhaps the most radical subjective consequence you positing, directly connecting the structure to the experience. Can you elaborate a bit on why this has to be an irreducible non-classical effect? Why can't classical mechanisms account for that subjective break?
Absolutely. Because the system fundamentally loses the ability to generate the necessary temporal overlap required for continuous subjective reality. Consciousness isn't just integrated information. We argue it's fundamentally integrated duration. The flip, therefore, is experienced subjectively as the instantaneous cessation of reality itself. This collapse of local time flow is, we believe, the true subjective hard problem consequence, which purely classical models really struggle to address. They might explain why the signal processing stops, but they can't easily explain why the experience of duration terminates instantaneously, as if time itself stops for the subject.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the termination of subjective duration requires a non-classical substrate. The collapse of the dP below that approximate 10 units epoch threshold, well, it could easily be viewed simply as the failure of the brain to generate the minimum coherence required for continuous, integrated gamma oscillation. Specifically, it fails to bridge that roughly tau equals 100 ms subjective integration window needed for a smooth flow of experience. This temporal collapse could merely be the observed break in the classical stream of consciousness, a failure of high-speed classical communication and synchronization to maintain the minimum required density for continuous experience. It doesn't necessarily point to the loss of an irreducible, non-classical substrate mandated by asymptotic friction. We might be able to account for this subjective discontinuity using purely classical limits of temporal integration in a highly complex system.
But if the limit is purely classical, why wouldn't the system be able to recover that temporal flow more smoothly just by restoring the coherence? The sheer abruptness, the complexity of the collapse suggests, to me at least, a more fundamental physical break, not just a signal processing bottleneck.
And that, I think, gets to the heart of our disagreement. We both agree on the complexity. We agree on the structural fragility, absolutely. We simply disagree on whether that complexity mandates a leap to a new physics to explain the failure mechanism and its subjective correlates.
So, to summarize my position, the ENT framework provides what we see as a necessary causal chain. It links an observable action, anesthesia, to an observable structural result, the PCI collapse, while crucially concurrently providing a causal mechanism for the hard problem via the termination of the IS signal. The specific, almost unbelievable structural instability, that N approximately 330 amplification factor, it demands a corresponding irreducible physical primitive, the IS event, to explain both the magnitude and the apparent necessity of the flip. We believe we've aligned the mathematics to the observed reality and provided a physical requirement for subjective experience itself.
And from my perspective, we have indeed mapped the structural skeleton of consciousness using observable data and rigorous mathematics, which is, frankly, an incredible achievement in formalizing the limits of the conscious state. But that critical link, the one going from the PCI collapse to a mandatory, non-classical signal, that link remains asserted, not yet definitively proven. The entire debate, as we've discussed, it really hinges on whether the universe's meta-laws, like POF, actually compel consciousness into existence for structural stability, or whether the flip is simply a highly accurate mathematical description of a very complex classical system reaching its inherent metabolic and structural limits. The question of the necessity of that non-classical break is the remaining pillar that requires a rigorous empirical exploration in the material.
And that exploration is precisely what the rigorous structural predictions of ENT should allow us to pursue, ideally through experimental verification of its parameters and thresholds.
Indeed, the variables are clearly defined and potentially testable, but the final verdict on the fundamental nature of the flip, classical or non-classical, remains very much open for now.